Okay. Morning, everyone. I hope you slept well. Good morning. So today we're looking at first language versus second language learning. So we honing in on that as the topic for this morning. Before we do that, though, I just want to draw your attention to the Are You Connected course. I saw that you have been allocated to the course already, so you should be able to access it. There's some details there, just about when the lectures are, prescribed readings. I'm still considering what content from lectures I will put up. I likely will be putting the recordings of these lectures. But yeah, you'll find your tutorial work points or exercises on here. Tomorrow's, the one for Friday will be up by tomorrow morning. But the reading is there, so you can download the reading and you can get started in preparation for Friday. So just going a bit further down, you'll see here's the course outline, very important document. If you haven't seen it yet, come onto this course and then just click on that and download it. Has details about kind of DP assessment, kind of expectations for the course. The tutorial allocations, we're still waiting for that. So hopefully by the end of tomorrow, Ian will have done that. There will be tutorials, so even though you aren't allocated yet. And then for week 1, you'll see here's the prescribed reading by Kirsten Hummel. It's really an overview of first language learning, which you would have looked at already in first year, but in relation to second language learning. And it gets into quite a bit more detail than some of what we'll be looking at today. All right, so check the course out on Are You Connected? Yeah, the register's going around, just make sure you sign that. Okay, so today I'm going to be speaking broadly about six topics. We might skip some of them depending on how the time goes. But yeah, the question of how do children and adults differ when it comes to language learning? So yeah, the biology side of things has a lot to do with neurology in particular, the brain. Then also just the process of acquisition, the way that it occurs, the environment, the input that we receive, there's differences there. Things relating to adult cognition, how we think as adults versus how children do, as well as how we feel and are motivated. In other words, the affective factors. Yeah, and then we will do actually another lecture where we go deeper into this on the impact of the L1 on the L2 as you learn. So that's section 5, linguistic transfer and interference, but I'm just going to highlight a few things there. It's pretty interesting. It's part of the reason why we're doing another lecture on it. And then the final one is ultimate attainment and proficiency. So like the kind of fluency that you develop as a child versus as an adult learner. Okay. So starting with biological foundations. You will have encountered the critical period hypothesis, that there is a critical period in which language learning occurs. I'm not sure if you have encountered these things, maybe if you've done some psychology or neuroscience. So lateralization, which is something that happens in the brain at a certain age, and then also just the concept and also the reality of brain plasticity. So I'm going to go into both of those just a little bit deeper. So starting with the critical period hypothesis, just put up your hand if you have encountered this before in Ling 1. Okay. Is anyone here taking Ling 2, but they didn't do Ling 1? Okay, so you should have encountered this then. Okay, so I mean, I'm probably going to go over a few things that you're familiar with, so I won't take too long here. But it's obviously the optimal window for acquiring language becomes a lot more difficult after around about puberty. That seems to be the terminal point of that critical period. After that, things change. There's been a lot of like brain development. And once you start learning a language around about after puberty, the kind of fluency that you can acquire is going to be probably different. Not in all cases, but will probably be. And so yeah, there's very strong evidence for the critical period hypothesis in first language acquisition, and maybe you encountered cases of feral children or neglected children who were not taught language when they were really young. And if they made it to the age to like it when they were teenagers, even actually later, so 7, 8, 9, their ability to pick up language was extremely compromised. So they struggled. And I mean, some of them maybe learned 100 words after they hadn't had language. They were raised by wolves. And the maximum of language that they could acquire after the critical period, so pretty much in their early teenage years, was minimal. And so that provides some strong evidence from that domain. But its application to L2 learning or second language acquisition is debated. So whether in terms of phonology, so pronunciation and accent, whether the critical period will affect the acquisition of those features of language. And then also grammar. So one's ability to actually pick up very intuitively all the grammatical features of the language. One thing that is certain, I think kind of the scholarship around this is pretty settled, is that adults have a capacity to learn vocabulary like mad. So they can become extremely proficient in the whole kind of lexis or vocabulary of a language, but that doesn't mean that they can pick up like phonology and things like all the grammatical features and master them perfectly. Okay. However, sometimes you do get some people who are adult learners and they reach to the point where it's almost as if they grew up learning that language. So that is a question mark. And how can that occur? Is it there's something very specific about them, or is there something that everyone else who is a second language learner is missing? It's probably more the first. Okay, so then moving on to lateralization and brain plasticity. So these are things that occur or are in the brain that affect, at least it's hypothesized to, and I think there's some strong evidence for it, affects language learning. So lateralization is just where you have obviously the right side of your brain and the left side of your brain. Prior to puberty, that is quite fluid for children. So brain functions might be happening on both sides. However, around the time of puberty, it looks like certain functions go to the right and certain functions go to the left. So in the case of language, that's the left hemisphere of the brain. I always actually personally struggle to figure out which is left and right. So it would be on this side of my brain, at least. That's very likely where the language activity, as I'm using these words right now to speak to you, it's being processed over here. Yeah, and it completes around puberty. And that process, that neurological, biological process might help explain, probably not completely, why it becomes more difficult. And so connected to lateralization is the idea of brain plasticity, which is just the ability for the brain to reorganize itself and kind of adapt. And we know that young children's brains have high plasticity, but it's also not fixed where language functions occur. So for instance, if a child has had brain damage or something has happened to them, maybe and one side of their brain has been compromised, the other side of the brain, prior to kind of lateralization occurring, they can actually take over those functions and they can still be fully kind of operational language-wise, even if it's on the right side of the brain. So there's that plasticity, that ability to be plastic, to like, I don't know, I mean, in our minds, plastic is usually quite hard, but you can bend it, right? So in this case, it's like the brain can almost bend to adapt. Yeah, and so the plasticity decreases with age. I'm not precisely sure. This isn't my kind of area of interest or expertise, but I'm not sure how they actually measure the decrease in plasticity. Maybe it's the amount of neurons firing. If anyone knows this from psychology, please do tell me. But nonetheless, however they measure that, it's just harder for older learners. Okay. So I just wanted to show you this. This is maybe kind of an application of some of this theory that we've been learning. This is a language learning application, which I think it was launched in the late 90s. It's called Rosetta Stone, and they have software, and their whole thing is about teaching you to learn, obviously as an adult or as a teenager, someone who already has is able to use a computer, so you're older than like a small baby. But their whole idea is that you can learn exactly like a child can learn. So that's their selling point. And I remember trying this back in the day when I was learning and flirting with all kinds of languages and trying to learn. And it was really bad because it was trying to apply the way that children learn. And in effect, it's requiring you to intuitively try and pick up the rules all the time. But it fails to like account for the fact that you've developed certain skills now as adults for learning that you prefer actually to how children learn. But it's just really interesting how the theory of how children learn has been taken because they learn so well. It almost becomes the selling point for certain products where they market themselves and then they create their product as if that's the way that adults learn as well. But it's not necessarily the case. So it might be that this product is bad. That's what I'd suggest. But try it yourself. Okay, so moving on from the biological foundation. So that's obviously crucial. Obviously, language activity takes place in the brain, also in the mind, which is kind of abstracted out the brain. And we don't understand kind of how consciousness relates with the brain itself. So we don't know whether all of language is, you can reduce it just to like brain function. But beyond that, then there's obviously the acquisition process, the things that aren't biological but are more behavioral. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we will be looking at it later in the course. But yeah, it's very straightforward. For first languages, it's implicit. I mean, I don't think any of you sat down with a textbook as a 2-year-old and was studying your mother tongue. But it does require, this is maybe also you can quibble and argue with this, whether it always requires explicit instruction, but it does require some kind of conscious learning as a second language learner. And with regard to universal grammar, which you would have encountered as well, obviously first language learners have this. It's there, it's very active, it's primed to receive linguistic information and then transform it into language fluency. But for second language learners, they need to rely on other things. And often, I'd like to kind of highlight this, the prior knowledge they have, the L1 that they already have is often crucial. Because that's the basis from which they assume other languages operate. So if your first language is English, you might think then that the English grammar and syntax is normal, and then when you learn Mandarin Chinese, you'd be surprised that things work differently. Whereas if you're just a child, that'd be supernatural that Mandarin doesn't have anything to indicate tense, for instance. Or at least any in the same way that we do in English. Okay, so just a bit of a summary here. over these last two that I've looked at, these last two sections. So children have plasticity, lateralization still happening within the critical period, access to universal grammar, and then all of these things are on the flip side for adults or second language learners. Okay, so another obvious difference then between first language and second language learning is the kind of exposure and time spent with people who are using language that's kind of aimed at helping you learn. So if you're a baby, if you're a toddler, you'll either be around other older children or caregivers, parents, whoever, who will be talking with you. And everything that you're kind of doing at that stage of life, I guess it's just a human reality, is aimed at developing skills for being able to communicate and interact with others. So, and kind of naturally, people will engage with children in that way. So it's constant. And it's really easy to learn something when you're constantly thinking about it, constantly doing it. Whereas with second language learning, as you all know, this is not your only course. You're doing other things. You've got lives outside of university, hobbies, things you enjoy doing. So there's always this like competing priorities in terms of how much time will I spend doing this versus my other things. And so unless, for instance, you were studying abroad in a different country where English was not the main language of communication, and you just were completely immersed. And that does happen, obviously. And that's often said to be the best way for adults to learn. But for most, especially in this day and age, classroom instruction of some sort is normal. And obviously then that has implications on the amount of exposure to the language, because if it's like, and this is actually a problem in our schools where children are being taught second languages or first additional language, second additional language, whatever the terminology we use, and they spend so little contact time and so little time actually in those lessons even engaging with the language that, you know, come the end of high school, they seldom actually are able to use the language proficiently like they would if they were small kids learning. So yeah, and I guess I just wanted to make the point that that's why input, just the idea of input, what you're getting in, is such a focus in SLA because it's scarce. It's a scarce resource. It's not like first language learning where you're constantly getting input and everything is just kind of going through your language acquisition device and creating perfect language. Okay, so this is another thing which obviously there's differences between children and adults, and we will be focusing in on, I guess, adults later in the course. But I just wanted, maybe you can just try and think in your minds, what would the motivations be for a young child to improve or to learn how to speak to people? Maybe you can just shout out a few ideas why, if you were a 2-year-old, you wanted to improve your language. Any ideas? Yeah? Interesting. Yeah, that might be part of it, particularly if you were corrected in a very strong way that you didn't want to be corrected again. Yeah, so I think that's an element of it. And then obviously there's reinforcement if that happens lots of times that you shouldn't be speaking incorrectly. But as you'll notice, and I think in the reading you'll encounter it, that for children who are young, and this is like first language acquisition generally, you can correct them and they will not notice the correction because they are operating on a set of rules that are almost different from yours. Because they're learning, so they will use language in a very regular way. So instead of saying I went home, they would say I goed home, and then you would correct them and say, oh, you went home, and they'd say yes, I goed home, right? So they do, and they don't notice necessarily. but nonetheless, at a later stage, they have some kind of motivation. I mean, you can argue that there is no motivation. It's actually just a natural process. They're not motivated to improve that specific thing of past tense to go. So yeah, any other ideas of why they would? It's kind of like a bad question because I think motivation doesn't really apply. Whereas, yeah, older learners tend to rely on their analytical skills and memory rather than instinctive learning. And I think that's both a function of just growing up, how we then operate in the world. Obviously, our memory is now something that we rely on more. Although in this day and age, we can just outsource everything to note-taking apps and AI. But also just obviously all of you have developed some degree of analytical skills. And that's how we're used to engaging with the world and thinking and learning. So we don't do it intuitively like young children. So our cognitive strategies, our strategies of thinking work differently. And that then obviously would affect. So I'm kind of answering the question here, why? But just to look at a few, so obviously children are a lot more uninhibited, particularly when it comes to making mistakes. So like the example I was just talking about, like they couldn't care less if they're making a language mistake. But if you think about adults, and this also interacts with an adult's personality, some people are very willing to just kind of throw out language irrespective of whether it's correct or not. But many are quite inhibited when they know that they are not going to be able to speak correctly because they obviously are aware of how other people will receive them, what other people will think. Self-conscious. Yeah, so kids often not scared of making mistakes. And I don't want to say that all children are like this, but when you're really young, you are like this. Maybe once you, in middle childhood, like 7 to 9, you're becoming more aware and you can become maybe more self-conscious, more inhibited. But in the main, that's more an adult feature of learning. Another thing with children is like sometimes they just don't, they're willing to accept ambiguity about the meaning of words. Not always. There is a stage that they ask, well, what does this mean? And what does that mean? And how's this different? But I think for adults, we're so used to now having things that mean things that we understand. And when they don't, we want to try and figure out what that is. So we seek resolution, and that can often also derail us from learning because we spend so much time trying to understand the specifics that then we like you miss the forest for the trees, to use the analogy. Yeah. So this is just a comment on it's natural for children without explicit awareness or motivation to learn a language, whereas for adults, there's attitudes, beliefs, goals, it's conscious, etc., etc. Okay, so moving on then to linguistic transfer and interference. So I'm going to spend a bit of time here. I'm going to try and make it a bit more interactive as well. So the two main things that we'll be looking at now is positive transfer and negative transfer. So I want, can any of you, so in what we did yesterday, when I got the second languages in the room, how many of you have learned English as a first language and then learned Afrikaans as a second language? Can I just see a few hands of some people who have? Okay, cool. And then how many people have learned also as their first language and then moved on to another Nguni language as either a second or third language? So maybe they moved, but they developed proficiency. Obviously, they're very similar. They're mutually intelligible. Okay, so there's a few people in the room, but just in those kind of situations, because the languages are similar to each other, they come from the same language group. So it's the Germanic languages in the case of Afrikaans and English, although English has all sorts of other linguistic influences. As does Afrikaans, obviously. It's not just purely Dutch. There's also Malay influences and various others. But there is a transfer that occurs when you're learning your first language and going to your second. And so some of that I'm mentioning here are cognates. Do any of you know what a cognate is? I don't know if you've learned it in first year. Anyone? Okay, so a cognate is it's a word or a phrase that has an equivalent that's there's a similarity between the two. So we'll look at a few of those now. But then also grammar patterns. So for instance, if you are used to how Xhosa has a sentence, and then you look at the equivalent sentence in isiZulu, you will and even other African languages kind of north of our border, sub-Saharan Africa, many of the languages operate in the same way. So if you looked at Swahili, for instance, you'd also notice similarities in the syntax and the structure of the language, and sometimes also the vocabulary. So cognates more relates to vocabulary. Grammar patterns is more syntax a lot of the time, but also the way that you indicate the tense, whether something happened yesterday or is happening tomorrow, things like that. So there's transfer that can occur between your first language and your second language. But then there's also negative transfer, which is when it interferes. Like it just messes things up because you're assuming that the language works in one way and then it actually is completely different and you don't have any frame of reference for it. So okay, so here's an example. And I'm not differentiating between positive and negative. So, el hotel tiene un bar y un restaurante. What does that mean? So obviously you'd recognize hotel, you'd recognize restaurant, and bar. And what do you think that it means? Maybe does someone want to try a translation, but also you can't know Spanish? Anyone? But if someone were to say to you, el hotel tiene un bar y un restaurante, and then, they went to the restaurant and they were very happy, you'd assume it means something like, oh, this place has a restaurant and a bar, that's cool, But because you know English, and English has cognate words, so the cognates here are hotel, bar, restaurante. And now I think hotel and bar actually originally came from English and then they were borrowed into Spanish. So Spanish maybe has actually I think if I remember correctly, the word for hotel is like albergo or something like that for hotel. But often they use this word and you'll see similarities. This is how languages, they always borrow from each other. It's very normal. But because of that, they are cognates. So restaurante, that I think was maybe originally French and it was borrowed from French into English. You can correct me on this. I'm maybe getting my linguistic history wrong. But almost all the Romance languages that are derived from Latin would have a word like restaurante. So they're all cognates. So if you were a Portuguese speaker, you would see the sentence, you'd immediately understand it. Same with English, because we have so much Romance language coming through French and Latin. So this is where there's positive language transfer. It's an example of that. Here's another example. And many of you are somewhat familiar with Afrikaans, I'm sure, but obviously Dutch and Afrikaans are similar. So de professor werkt in de universiteit. This is so easy to understand, right? It's really easy. It's super similar to English as well. So if you can just imagine, if you wanted to learn Dutch, your knowledge of English and possibly Afrikaans will help you so much. It'll be much quicker. And yesterday when I mentioned that I learned Esperanto, part of what made Esperanto so easy was it had so many cognates with English already. So, and then on top of it, I went on to learn a whole bunch of other languages and also I should have said yesterday, almost all those languages that I listed, I cannot speak. That was just me learning from a certain stage. So all of it's gone out my brain now. But I was able to pick up them a lot quicker because Esperanto and English had a whole bunch of words that then I was constantly encountering in Spanish and Italian and in French. And it was just slight, differences in terms of spelling and pronunciation, but it was the same word. And that made things so much easier. I got words for free, right? So that's kind of positive language transfer. But then you have things like this. Yesterday, I go to the store. And this is an example from Chinese. What's going on there? What should it be? So yesterday, I went to the store. I shouldn't have used that example earlier. Anyway, so it's obviously, they are using the present tense version of go, but referring to the past. And the reason for this in Chinese, have any of you actually taken Chinese? Are any of you in the Chinese class? Yeah, so the way that Chinese works, you have done some Japanese though, hey? Yes? Do you still do Japanese in first year Ling? You don't? Okay, I'm showing my age. So the way that Chinese works is that instead of changing the verb itself, so to go becomes went in the past, go or goes in the present, and to go or will go in the future. In Chinese, you always just use the same word or the same kind of syllable you always just use that as the verb, but then you add on a particle at the end of the sentence to indicate that that entire statement that you've just made, put that into the past. So they use a different system of indicating tense. So in this case, they would say, 昨天 yesterday, 我去, I forget what store means, 我去 store. And 去 is always just go. But then if you want to say 昨天我去 store, le, you would add a le right at the end of it. And that le indicates that thing was completed, it's happened, it was yesterday, right? So also to say that there's negative language transfer. They are taking their frame of how tense works in Chinese, and then they're applying it to English. And it doesn't quite work. But at the same time, you completely understand it. So a lot of linguists will have arguments about whether this is really incorrect if everyone understands what is intended. Anyway, that's more sociolinguistics, that's another argument. So I have a car red, that's from Spanish. What do you think's happening there? What's happening in their first language? What do they do with adjectives? So they swap them around, and languages like also are similar, right? Where you would say, you'd have your noun first, and then you would modify your noun with something that comes after it, right? But what's interesting is that when you have second language learners of, for instance, English, who have come from also background, that hasn't been something that I've heard as an error. There are other errors, but in the case of Spanish speakers, this is a very strong pattern in their minds. So this is an error that you often see, that they would say, I have a car red, and you're like, oh. And that's, yeah, so that's kind of more a syntax thing of where you would place words. Okay. So moving on from that, and as I'll say, we'll go far more deeply into why all of those things occur. I obviously dwelt in it some now, but there's other aspects to the impact of the first language, particularly maybe on pronunciation, on what your mouth is able to do, what's just really what's normal, and the previous knowledge that you have. So in terms of ultimate attainment and proficiency, so the competence that you acquire if you're a first language learner is extremely competent. It's pretty much guaranteed. You're gonna sound like someone who knows that language through and through. I'd be actually interested in looking more into cases where that doesn't happen and why. It's probably due to other brain development related things. But it is extremely rare in a second language. So yeah, I don't know if any of you have tried and then gotten feedback from first language speakers in your second language about how you sound. Some people can manage it, and some people do for whatever reason. I wouldn't say that they have language aptitude. There's a lot of controversy surrounding whether certain people are just good language learners and others aren't. What definitely is true is that some people have the ability to learn things in ways that help them learn language as well. but it's not necessarily like a language learning gene that they have. But even for those people, it's extremely rare for them to develop pronunciation, particularly pronunciation, because their mouths have been morphed in a way. They're used to making sounds in a certain way, and it takes so much time and attention to detail, and almost just training your tongue, training the shape of your mouth when you're pronouncing things to change. I mean, there's certain, particularly in Arabic and in some of the languages from the Indian subcontinent, there's the way that they pronounce R and D is like D. And they have 4 different versions of like T. It's something between T and D. And it's really difficult to even hear the differences as someone who didn't grow up speaking Arabic in particular. So like that's an example of where it's really difficult for second language learners to achieve first language-like competence. And part of this, as we were discussing earlier, is just like your brain plasticity, but also the plasticity of your mouth and the muscle memory that now has developed over years and years and years. And, you know, we reach a point of maturation where we don't really develop anymore. I think the only thing that continues to grow are our ears and maybe 1 or 2 other things. But like things stop growing and things kind of stay down. Okay, so another element of this, and we'll also look at some examples of this, is fossilization. So this might sound like it's coming from archaeology, but it also is present in linguistics, and you also maybe encountered this already. But this is very normal. So if you were to hear me speak Mandarin, which I haven't spoken for a long time, there would be certain patterns that I would consistently use that for a first language speaker, where they would just think, this is so weird. Why does he carry on doing that? And yeah, so persistent errors that don't improve with time, even when you are corrected. And part of that, like I was just saying now, is you get into certain habits and then you're fully matured, your brain is not as plastic, it's really difficult to change. And as a result, you're kind of just stuck with those features of your second language. So this is a common one, and I'm putting these here, and I'm not giving you all the theoretical background, because there are certain ways of analyzing languages. It's called contrastive analysis and error analysis that we will look into more. That then helps you understand, well, why is it that there's positive language transfer? Why is it that there's fossilization? Where did it emerge from originally? And in this case, the apple R on the table, obviously the thing that's like a bit weird there is there's a singular apple and then there's R, which usually refers to that the subject is a plural of some sort in English. But the reason why you might say this is because there's negative language transfer to begin with. Of maybe in your language, you don't differentiate for the amount. You just say, so in Afrikaans often, for people who have fossilized language, they might say, the apples is on the table, or something like that, or the apple are on the table. And it's because in Afrikaans, and it's so much simpler than English, and I wish English were simple like this, they just have, it's us. That is what the verb is to say X is Y. They don't make all these weird plural distinctions and change this is called a copulative verb. So that's the first one. I going to France next year is another one. This is weird in English for various reasons, but I'm not going into the language transfer side of things here. This is more just, you can imagine people who will be maybe extremely proficient in the language. Their vocabulary will be very broad, but they will consistently say things like this. I going to France next year. And that's because they are so used to saying something like this that there's, they're not really learning anymore. They're just using what they have learned. And that's just very normal for adults. You kind of get stuck in your ways. She said, is too late to apply. In this case, it would be a language that often just cuts off the pronoun. So that's because the pronoun is contained in the verb. So this would probably be someone who speaks French or Spanish, and they often just drop the subject pronouns. but maybe they didn't try and learn in their learning stage systematically and correct this error. So then this happens all the time. I was waiting for train. In this case, it's the article. I was waiting for the train. The language probably doesn't have a or the. So then they just put the noun straight after the preposition. So these are all examples of fossilization. My son has 26 years. This is another one. This comes from Spanish and some of the Romance languages. They just say, to indicate age, you'd say, I have 30 years or whatever. And people didn't correct them, or they didn't take note of the corrections. And then this became how they always spoke. So when was it? In 2014, I was always struck by this. It was not in a university, but it was a lecture by an amazing Afrikaans man who was involved in some work in inner city Pretoria. And he had the broadest vocabulary that I'd ever heard. He was using words that I never used as a first language English speaker. And yet he consistently made errors like the first one. And it was jarring. It was really weird because like this man is so proficient in English and yet he's making these errors. And I think fossilization and this as a phenomenon helps explain that. It doesn't indicate anything about obviously a person's intelligence or a person's learning, but it does mean that they just have linguistic habits that are hard to kick and they probably will never. And also there's not really much reason to do it because if everyone understands what you're saying, what is the point? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. We have about 3 minutes left for the lecture. The tutorial exercises will be available on Are You Connected by tomorrow morning. So that'll be in preparation for Friday. The reading is on Are You Connected? The course is visible. You can see it. And come prep for the first quiz. So just to prep, it's in effect the exercise sheet that you'll see, which will really just help you kind of think through some of the things from the reading, read the reading, and then just come to the tutorial. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. Hi. Do you need a sign? Yes.